It's a heartbreaking story about a kayaking trip that took a tragic turn when a crocodile attacked a whitewater guide. Hendry Kotze, who was just 35 years old, was leading an expedition down the White Nile and into Congo when the incident occurred. Unfortunately, two American tourists who were with him witnessed the entire thing in horror. Hello, and welcome to Amazing Animal Stories. Today, we tell you the story of Hendry Kotze, who was eaten by a man-eating crocodile while he was kayaking. However, before we begin, we would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe to our channel and also press the bell icon. Let's get started. Hendry Kotze had always been aware of the risks of his adventurous lifestyle, and he often spoke about the inevitability of death. Despite this, his thirst for adrenaline and exploration drove him forward. In his memoirs, he wrote about feeling a deep sense of melancholy after each expedition came to an end. Hendry grew up in South Africa, where he found school to be a bit boring. He was more drawn to the arts, but after graduation, he decided to go traveling before eventually joining the military. When he returned to Africa at the age of 21, he was seeking adventure, and in 1997, he found it on the Zambezi River, which forms the border between Zambia and Zimbabwe. The river quickly became a hotspot for thrill-seeking tourists, with outfitters setting up bungee jumps and skydives over the stunning Victoria Falls. But the most popular activity was whitewater rafting, and Hendry quickly found himself drawn to this exciting and dangerous pursuit. When Hendry was just 21 years old, he landed a job with Peter Meredith's whitewater rafting company, despite having never kayaked or rafted a river before. After learning how to roll and ride a kayak in a swimming pool, Hendry quickly found himself guiding tourists down one of the world's most challenging commercial rivers, tackling grade 5 rapids with ease. Peter was impressed with Hendry's fearless attitude, describing him as having more balls than brains. Hendry's daring nature was apparent when on one occasion, he ran a deadly Class 6 rapid in his kayak without telling anyone. Meanwhile, the entire group was portaging their rafts and kayaks around. He barely made it through but was convinced he was the best. Peter warned him he'd be fired if he ever again pulled a stunt like that. Despite this incident, Peter and Hendry became good friends, and in 2004, they embarked on an incredible adventure together. Their mission was to follow the Nile River from its source to the sea, paddling over 4,000 miles from Lake Victoria to the Mediterranean. Hendry's solo paddle of the Congo followed a few years later, which took him 5 months to complete. During his journey, he survived being ambushed and hunted by cannibalistic Gambi tribesmen. Hendry faced countless challenges, including dodging hippos and crickets and sleeping on the banks of rivers with nothing but his bivouac and fire to protect him. His adventurous spirit knew no bounds, but he realized he was taking too many risks, and it was time to settle down after meeting a girl. However, in 2010, he received an email from two professional American kayakers, Ben Stokesbury and Chris Korbalak. They were looking for a guide to navigate the upper Congo River. Even though Hendry had decided to retire from kayaking and exploration, he couldn't resist the promise of another epic adventure. He helped plan their route, writing a detailed itinerary that only an explorer of his caliber could provide. Despite his initial reluctance, Hendry eventually gave in to the call of the wild and joined Ben and Chris on a 2-month trip through the Congo's tributaries. In October 2010, the three kayakers began their expedition along the Ruzi River with a plan to be home for Christmas. Hendry's girlfriend was excited to see him again, especially since he had promised this would be his final expedition. As they stopped along the river to rest or make camp, they spoke with locals living on the riverbanks. They had an agreement with the International Rescue Committee to help refugees and rural communities, and in exchange for logistical assistance, Hendry had promised to gather feedback from the locals. During one such conversation with the community, they learned about the urgent need for clean water and education. They also discovered a major crocodile problem in the region. Over the past 2 decades, 125 people have fallen prey to these predators. The kayakers noted this information but had no idea that the area had been ravaged by years of battles between neighboring communities, resulting in over 5.4 million deaths. Most of the bodies had been thrown into the rivers, where they were devoured by the crocodiles, who had grown to enormous sizes and had developed a taste for human flesh. It was December 7, 2010, and the trio had been kayaking for a while when they encountered a sharp bend in the river. Despite Ben and Chris being well-known professional paddlers in extreme sports, Hendry had to teach them how to kayak in the African wilderness. He instructed them to tap their kayaks to create noise regularly, avoid eddies where hippos might lurk, and steer clear of sunbathing crickets on the riverbanks. On that day, they spotted some harmless 3-foot crickets on the muddy banks and drifted past them, taking in the natural beauty from their plastic boats. Whenever they spotted a large crocodile in the water, their protocol was to paddle together as fast as they could to outrun the potential threat. So far, their journey had been a mix of thrilling whitewater challenges and serene, quiet stretches through African bush. As they rounded the bend, they came upon a gentle stretch of the river about 100 feet wide, and the three men paddled closely together, focusing intently to avoid their blades touching. The kayakers were paddling down the river in a single file formation. Ben was leading, Hendry was in the middle, and Chris was trailing behind. Ben was constantly scanning the water and the riverbank for any signs of danger. The water was very calm, and the only movements came from the paddles of the three men. There was no indication of any crocodiles or hippos in the area, which was unusual. Little did they know that something was lurking in the water below them. Suddenly, an enormous crocodile appeared next to Hendry, taking everyone by surprise. Hendry gasped and exclaimed, "Oh my God!" It wasn't a scream of terror, but more of a matter-of-fact reaction to seeing the massive reptile so unexpectedly. Hendry's shout was cut short as the crocodile grabbed his left shoulder and pulled him underwater with lightning speed. Its bite force of over 4,000 psi was crushing Hendry's chest and neck. Despite being strapped into his kayak, Hendry could not resist the immense pressure. Ben and Chris watched in horror as Hendry's upturned kayak shook and tumbled above the water for a few terrifying seconds before being dragged underwater and out of sight. When the red plastic boat resurfaced, the cockpit was empty and Hendry was nowhere to be seen. The crocodile likely took Hendry to the bottom of the river to start its meal, knocking the air out of his lungs and disorienting him with sharp twists and rolls in an attempt to drown him. The crocodile, estimated to be around 15 feet long and weighing more than 2,000 pounds, had a head that indicated its size. Ben and Chris were shocked and quickly paddled away from the scene. Ben and Chris were shocked as they watched Hendry's kayak float by seemingly untouched. They couldn't believe that their friend was gone, taken by a massive crocodile right before their eyes. The villagers' warnings about the dangers of the river suddenly hit home. They realized they were in a remote and dangerous part of the world, far from the safety and comfort of their homes. The two men knew that they had to act fast. They asked the villagers for help but were met with reluctance and fear. Given the history of crocodile attacks in the area, the locals were understandably wary of venturing onto the river. However, Ben and Chris were determined, and they eventually managed to convince one of the villagers to take them out on a motorboat to search for Hendry's body. As they sped down the river, Ben and Chris couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. They knew they were risking their own lives by venturing out onto the water, but they were willing to take that chance to find their friend. Eventually, they came across Hendry's kayak floating in the water, and they were relieved to see that it was in perfect condition. There was no sign of struggle or indication that a massive crocodile had attacked and killed Hendry moments before. Hendry vanished without a trace, and his girlfriend felt something was wrong. As she checked her Facebook messages, her heart sank at the flood of condolences for Hendry. She couldn't believe it. They were supposed to meet soon, but now it seemed like there was no chance. Hendry was on his final expedition, and his girlfriend was devastated as she made her way to the Ugandan bar on New Year's Eve where they had planned to meet. She searched the crowd, hoping to see Hendry's beaming smile. The music pulsed through the dimly lit bar, and the clock ticked closer to midnight. The moment finally arrived, but to her dismay, Hendry was nowhere to be found. It was a tragic end to his final adventure.